Grant Robertson.
Not one option, Mr. Chair.
Robertson. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and so am I. Mr. Chair, I want to pick up where my colleague Megan Woods has, although perhaps not in the spectacular water display that we just saw over here, and talk about the two main concerns that the Labor Party has with Part 1 of this bill. In order to do that, Mr. Chair, it is important for those watching to remind ourselves what is the purpose of industry training and why does the government fund it. And essentially, industry training organisations, since they've been developed, have had three main roles. Those roles have been to set the standards for industry training, to organise industry training and administer industry training, and to ensure that the skills leadership function that's so desperately required in our workforce planning is undertaken. What does skills leadership mean? Well, what skills leadership means is working to identify where the skill needs are in a particular industry and ensuring that we have programs and courses that match up with those skill needs. Under this piece of legislation, that third of those industry training jobs has been taken away from industry training organisations. And it was a remarkable thing, Mr. Chair, in the Select Committee to be presented with the sort of nihilistic view of the world, some sort of anarcho-syndicalist view of the world, that skills leadership would just happen, that it would just occur, that no one needed to be in charge of it, it would just magically happen, and that some government agencies would do some things and other industry groups would step up to the plate, was one of the things that we heard. Well, that's just nonsense, Mr. Speaker. From my point of view and from the Labor Party's point of view, industry training organisations are the peak body of industry. This is the place where we can learn the most about what's required in the future in terms of skills. Yes, by all means, government departments have a role in making sure that they're feeding into that exercise of saying what are the next wave of skills that are needed in this industry. But the leadership role in that surely must come from the industry itself. And it was, as my colleague Dr Woods said, very odd for us on the Labor Party side to be being told by the National Party members that the government should pick this up. When we were saying, no, actually this is where industry should be leading. Industry knows best what is needed in terms of those skills. So we're very disappointed, Mr. Chair, in Part 1 of this bill to see that the skills leadership function disappears from the role of industry training organisations. We're disappointed that we can't support this bill because there's no doubt that there was and has been a need for industry training organisations to recalibrate themselves. Over a period of time, a number of them had grown to such an extent that they perhaps weren't servicing the exact needs of their industry, weren't servicing the needs of the businesses within the industry, and certainly weren't always servicing the needs of trainees. People were complaining they were seeing a lot of flash cars being driven by industry training organisations, but not the outcomes on the ground in terms of delivery of training. We accept that there was a need for some rationalisation of ITOs, and that's happened. And businesses have now bought back into the model. So it seems very odd to bring a piece of legislation to the House, we believe, that breaks that up. Just as things are getting better, Mr. Speaker, the government comes along and makes some quite fundamental changes that are contained here in Part 1. On the Labor Party side of the House, we strongly support industry training. It is so critical as part of the lifelong learning and the build-up of skills that make for a productive economy, that we have as many workers as possible engaged in industry training and a system that organises that in a way that meets the skill needs, allows people to develop their own skills, get transferable skills that can take them from one business to another and be recognised for that with qualifications. All of that's good. All of that's in the bill, but then it's broken apart by the two key clauses here, the removal of the skills leadership function and the opening up of funding for industry training to non-ITOs. Those two clauses are the reason why the Labor Party can't support this bill. And when we look at the regulatory impact statement that has been provided for this bill, it is quite instructive. It talks about why the government funds industry training, and it says the availability of common transferable qualifications and a training organisation considering the needs of the industry as a whole is akin to a public good which is unlikely to emerge without government intervention, particularly in industries with a high proportion of small firms. So that's the nub of the matter. That's the reason why industry, Mr. Chair.
Grant Robertson.
That's the reason why industry training is funded by the government. Not because an individual business needs to train its workers to do the particular jobs. That is the responsibility of an individual business, and they will, and in most cases do, go about doing that. What industry training says is we want a broadly skilled workforce that can move from one business to another, from one industry to another, with recognised qualifications and skills that are transferable. So that's actually what the regulatory impact statement says. Yet the government, in the new Clause 11A, opens up the funding of industry training to non-ITOs, effectively to individual businesses. It says to them, you can go off and do this. And every single submitter, bar one, who I will come back to, said they did not believe that this was the way to go. We had the remarkable situation of the Contractors Federation sitting down at the table. In fact, I think they were still standing up when they said it, and said, we agree with everything that the CTU has just said. And what the CTU had just said was, don't do this. Don't break up industry training. Don't effectively privatise industry training, because getting those transferable skills, those skills that are for an industry, not a specific business, is important to our future productivity. It will also fundamentally undermine the ITOs themselves. And in that quote from the regulatory impact statement, I mentioned their reference to the fact that the need for government intervention is particularly in industries with a high proportion of small firms. And it's the small firms that will miss out under this process, because it's the small firms who will be left behind. A big firm goes off and decides to run its own industry training, but small businesses will be left with increased costs to keep their ITOs going and further burdens on them as small businesses. My colleague Dr. Clark knows from his travels around the country talking to small business people that they're already struggling, and here will be an additional burden and here will be an additional cost. And so that's another problem. Not only will we end up with training that's not industry-wide but business-specific, but it will also undermine small businesses and increase their costs. There's already, Mr. Chair, a flexibility for employers to move from one ITO to another ITO. They're not stuck in the ITO they're in now, and we've seen quite a bit of that in recent times. So the argument that this opening up of industry training under Clause 11, the new Clause 11A, somehow or other will lead to increased flexibility is just plain wrong. The flexibility's in the system already. And the only organisation who came to the Select Committee and said, yes, we think this might be okay, was Business New Zealand. But, Mr. Speaker, it would be fair to say that Business New Zealand's endorsement was a little on the lukewarm side. They, in fact, told the committee that they weren't opposed to the idea, that they said that they were cautiously supportive, but they wanted to make sure that the approach was independently evaluated to ensure that it results in learning outcomes linked to industry needs. That's what they said. They were worried. Business New Zealand was worried that this opening up of industry training to individual businesses would mean that we wouldn't have industry-wide skills and qualifications. Business New Zealand don't really like this either, that's the truth. And every other submitter, from the Contractors Federation to the CTU, Career Force, the EPMU, the National Council of Women, every submitter said there's no justification for opening up industry training to be funded to individual businesses. Mr. Chair, it's hard to escape the view that it's simply in this bill as part of a wider agenda of privatisation, be it charter schools, be it PPPs. It's all in the same direction, and it is the wrong direction, Mr. Speaker. We want a strong public education system that delivers skills, training and education that's applicable right across the board. That's why the government should fund these things. We support strong funding for industry training and apprenticeships, but under this bill and under this part of the bill, that is consistently undermined. Mr. Chair, it seems remarkable that in trying to consolidate and improve some bits of industry training, if this bill passes in the form that it is in now, it will fundamentally undermine industry training. I challenge the National Party members on the other side of the House to get up and tell us why industry training funding should be delivered to specific businesses to deliver training that is only relevant to them. Why should we not have a situation where we only fund as a government skills that go across an industry rather than specific business?
Honourable Nick Smith.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to take a call on this bill, and firstly to make the point that